For those unfamiliar with a life cycle assessment, or in short, LCA, can you explain exactly what it is and how it can help project managers better understand the environmental impacts that might be associated with a product or a service?
It's a method of evaluating the environmental benefits, but also burdens of a good or a service from cradle to grave. So, including raw material extraction, transportation of raw materials, transformation of raw materials into intermediate materials. So, that's something.
Did you know that over 90% of a product's environmental impact is determined during the design phase, long before it reaches the end user? From raw material extraction to manufacturing and use, a product's full life cycle can carry a much bigger environmental footprint than most project managers realize. In today's episode, and in honor of International Women in Engineering Day, we're going to explore the power of life cycle assessment, or LCA, with Julie Sinistore, Ph.D., Senior Vice President at WSP in the USA. Julie will talk about what LCA really is, how it works, and why it's a vital tool for building a more sustainable future. From uncovering hidden environmental costs to guiding smarter design and planning decisions, really to help you as a project manager provide more value to your clients. Julie's going to share some practical insights for integrating life cycle thinking into your projects. I'm your host, Anthony Pisano, and this is the AEC Project Management Podcast. Let's jump in. All right, now I'd like to welcome our guest onto the show for today. Julie Sinistore is a PhD and Senior Vice President at WSP in the US. Julie, welcome to the AEC Project Management Podcast.
Thanks. Thanks so much for having me.
So to get us started off here, Julie, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself, what inspired your journey into sustainability and life cycle assessments, and kind of how has your role with this evolved in the AEC industry over time?
Yeah, happy to talk about that. Sometimes I joke and people laugh, but I do kind of really mean it. I got into sustainability really early in life. I think I was inspired since age 10 by movies and things in the common zeitgeist about caring about the environment, things like, Captain Planet and all of that. So I always thought I'd do something environmental. I didn't know what sustainability was until I went to college. And I started off as an environmental science major, and I realized pretty quickly that was cleaning up messes. And I said, oh no, I don't really want to do that. I want to stop the messes from happening in the first place. And they said, oh, that's natural resource management. That's not environmental science, which, you know, we can argue what those words mean. But I started down that road of natural resource management. That's what I did my undergrad in. And then eventually when I went to graduate school, I was uh, brought on and told that I would have a research assistantship, but I would need to figure out what my research would be. And I was given a couple of fully funded projects to pick from. And one of them was a life cycle assessment of Wisconsin corn grain ethanol. And I thought, that sounds interesting. I don't really know about this life cycle assessment thing, but it sounds like fun. So I did that for my master's research, and it ended up being also my PhD research on cellulosic ethanol. And I ended up getting a job doing that right out of graduate school, and then on to another job as a consultant, and then on to WSP, where I've been for the last 9 years. And my role has evolved a lot over time. I've gone from being much more on the modeling doing side to being more at the project management, orchestration, business development, kind of bigger picture side. Even though I do work in private industry for WSP, I still see it kind of like having my own sort of research group where I am the PI, the principal investigator, uh, kind of guiding and leading a team of experts in all the various types of work that they do.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's great when you can have like a smaller practice or division, if you will, within a larger organization, because you can get all the support you need kind of from the larger organization, but you can operate kind of as a smaller group and, intimate group in terms of what you're trying to accomplish and what you're trying to do. So I think that that's a really good way to operate. So For those unfamiliar with a life cycle assessment, or in short, LCA, can you explain exactly what it is and how it can help project managers better understand the environmental impacts that might be associated with a product or a service?
Absolutely. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It's a method of evaluating the environmental benefits, but also burdens of a good or a service from cradle to grave. So, including raw material extraction, transportation of raw materials, transformation of raw materials into intermediate materials. So, that's something like turning iron ore into steel, into rebar, into a building, so on and so forth. But you could really do it with absolutely anything. It's one of the reasons I am so interested in it and took my career path that way is because you can really apply it to absolutely anything. Looking at everything from greenhouse gas emissions, water consumption, energy, also other types of air emissions, smog, and other types of emissions to water that affect water quality, like eutrophication. We've got acidification and all kinds of other impacts that we can quantify. And it helps many of our clients understand where the sources of impacts are from their product or their service. More often than not, they suspect it's from things like packaging and transportation. But usually, unless the packaging is very heavy, and or the product that you're selling is very heavy, it needs to be refrigerated and flown all over the planet, usually those are actually not the hotspots in the production of a product or the administration of a service. It's usually actually, particularly for a product, the energy used in manufacturing. It's not even usually the materials. Again, depends on what it's made out of, but it's more likely than not going to be focused on the energy and the materials. And what's interesting within WSP is we work with many people who also do like energy modeling and look at the types of equipment and processes that are used to make things. And so we can work and inform not just our clients, but also our colleagues about the sources of environmental impacts and brainstorm ways to reduce them. For example, if there are extra steps that maybe don't need to happen or can happen at lower temperatures or for a shorter amount of time, that could save energy, therefore cost, but also greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental impacts.
That's interesting. So, for our listeners who are mostly project managers, I think the one thing to kind of take away there is in terms of the main drivers of environmental impact on a product or a project. It's not necessarily the transportation or the disposal, which a lot of people think it is, but it can be the production and the energy components of your project.
Yes, definitely. And another thing that gets eliminated when we do this kind of work is the tremendous potential for renewable energy to reduce the environmental impacts of goods and services if it's rolled out all over the place. We live in a very global supply chain, and so yes, things are getting moved around all the time, and we think that that's the major source of the emissions, but something to also pay attention to is the electricity grid of where the item is being produced or where a certain step in the process is happening and how that grid mix, whether it's heavy on industrial sources like coal or natural gas or even nuclear and things like that, can have environmental impacts that are local but also global. So global being greenhouse gas emissions, but local being, for example, how much water it takes to provision power. And that's
Mm,
actually a paper that we published with WRI about the water embedded in electricity generation.
that's great. I think this is really important for project managers today because you can't look at this as, oh, this is going to be a hindrance or slow down my project. I think you need to look at it as this is a way for me to provide more value to the stakeholders of the project, right? By making sure that we're being sustainable, environmentally friendly, focusing on some portions of the project where we can have reduction, right? Or waste
Yes.
reduction. And I think project managers that can really embrace that mindset and they're looking for ways to create more value from the environmental sustainability side of the project, that's what your clients, that's a piece of what you need to deliver to them if you want to deliver the most value to them. And I think that's why we wanted to talk to Julie a little bit today, just so that PMs can get a little bit more educated on these things. Because some of you probably don't know what an LCA is or haven't really had to deal with it yet. Or maybe you're a new PM and you're going to be dealing with it soon. So, Julie, how does LCA influence sustainable product or infrastructure design? And what tools or data are most valuable in kind of guiding some of these design decisions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's it's very helpful to implement and to at least do some sort of a screening assessment as early on in a product's design or a project's infrastructure design as possible, because this is when you can you have the most influence to pull certain levers to source certain products or not other products or from certain places, and to investigate potentially new novel ideas that could reduce the impacts of your product or your design. And so this could be a new product that's brand new and totally in the ideation phase, or it could be a product that's undergoing some sort of a reimagining, redesign, 2.0, 3.0, what's the latest, greatest, newest, most interesting thing. And what's often interesting is that clients will come to the table and they've got ideas, what if we made this out of recycled content, or what if this was a bio-based thing, or what if all these sorts of things. And this is a great time to explore those what ifs, to put it through a life cycle assessment and see, does using this bio-based material actually materially reduce the environmental impacts of the product, such that it's worth an additional cost or some additional engineering or design that will have to be done in order to make it usable in this sense. Same thing with infrastructure. I remember doing a comparative LCA on a bridge design. A firm that specializes in designing very novel bridge solutions came to us and said, we want to know what the comparative environmental benefits are of our bridge design compared to a standard bridge design. And this is one of the real benefits of working at WSP. I don't know how to design bridges. That's not what I do.
Right.
But there are plenty of people at WSP who do design bridges. So we were able to say to this client, okay, you give us your alternative design and you tell us the fundamentals of span where your bridge would go. And we'll have our engineers design a mock bridge that as they would in a conventional, traditional way of designing a bridge. And then they can give me the material takeoffs for what it would take to build that bridge. And you, client, give me the material takeoffs for what it would take to design your bridge. And we'll do a compare and contrast. And I can tell you, okay, yeah, if your bridge uses X% fewer materials and it lasts Y% longer, then the comparative environmental reduction in impacts is this. And then you can use that to explain some of the benefits of your bridge design and perhaps win that job, or get your bridge installed as opposed to a different design, because you're able to actually use data. So that's the other part you brought up, like, what about the tools that we use? And really, more important than the tools, I'm going to stress, is the data. There are lots of tools out there to do life cycle assessment. We have and or use most of the major ones. But honestly, you can do a life cycle assessment with any kind of a tool. You don't need some special, fancy, very expensive software platform to do a life cycle assessment. You really can do it in Excel, with spreadsheets. It can be a little tedious to do it that way, but you can do it. What's more key and challenging to come by are quality data. So you can imagine if I had to do a life cycle assessment on a bridge, this is from cradle to grave. I mentioned earlier, it goes all the way back to mining iron ore from the environment to make
Uh,
steel, to make rebar, to make a wall assembly. There's a lot of steps there. So every time we go to do an LCA, it's not like we're going back all the way to mining the ore and gathering data about how that specific ore was mined. No, there are data sets out there, and entire databases out there with already calculated the embodied environmental impacts of these inputs we would need to make a bridge or a car or a semiconductor or a data center or ice cream. My joke, I like to say I've done everything from yoga mats to data centers. And I have also done ice cream and food products and all these kinds of things. So high quality data that that are meant to fit together. That's the other thing about having carefully curated data, because
Mm,
you can imagine how the system boundary of the rebar, like it has to end at a certain place, and then you have to pick that up at another place. Well, you don't want it to overlap, and you don't want there to be a gap, but that has to be
right.
really clear and very intentionally curated with whatever database you're using. And so we at WSP have access to all of the major commercial ones, and we're constantly looking for more data. But where I see a real potential for improvements would be in the implementation of AI to improve those services. But I don't want to get ahead of myself.
We'll dive into that for sure in a minute. But before we go there, I just want to go back to the design process for a second because I think that's the value for a project manager of being able to be involved from the beginning of the project to the end, from the design, through construction or through bidding out or whatever the project is. Because I think sometimes at larger companies or larger organizations, the PM maybe gets pulled in a little bit later, and so it's nice if, as the project manager, you're able to be involved in the design process, especially if that's a time where you might be able to have an LCA or start to really investigate things because you still have options at that point, right? You can be flexible, or even before that in the proposal stage, right? Where you're putting together a proposal, kind of like the client that you mentioned, and they're trying to stress to their client, what the savings or what the impact's going to be on it. So I think that speaks to the project manager. The earlier you can get your PMs involved in a project, even at the proposal stage, I think it's just going to benefit everybody throughout the project and throughout the life cycle of the project. And then I think the data point is really interesting, right? I think organizations that have really good data sources have an advantage in the market today, essentially. And
Yes.
like Julie was saying, like in terms of her job and her role, the data that WSP is able to pull and get in these databases, that's going to help her to put together the most accurate or different options in terms of being able to supply a client information, right? And different scenarios of what could happen if you did it this way or if you did it another way based on the data that we have available. And so, you mentioned there kind of AI, and that was kind of going to be where I wanted to go next. Kind of looking ahead, Julie, what emerging trends are you seeing in product and service sustainability, especially in areas like AI or electricity use, data centers, agriculture, things of that nature?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I would be remiss if we are going to talk data centers and not mentioning a paper we just had released last week in the journal Nature with Microsoft on lifecycle assessment of alternative cooling technologies for data centers. So this is
Uh,
really interesting, really fantastic research. I'm so happy it's finally out there and we can talk about it. But one of the things that we looked at was this was for a general compute data center, but I could see how it could also apply to an AI data center. Different novel cooling technologies for data centers. So conventionally, we think of how we cool data centers as air cooling. We've got chillers and we're running chilled air through the data center to cool the racks and servers. But it can be quite inefficient. And with the changing climate in different places all over the world, sometimes air cooling is not very appropriate. It's not very efficient. And so what we looked at with this paper were these different novel alternative cooling technologies, such as submerging entire servers in one phase or two phase fluids that can absorb the heat, some boil at room temperature. And we also looked at direct to chip cooling through something called cold plates.
hmm,
And there's a lot of nuance to the paper. It is free and open source, so you don't have to have a subscription to read it. But it was very interesting. It was a very large effort. So taking advantage of both the people we have over at WSP who know a lot about data center design and about heating and cooling systems and how we reject heat in different locations on the world that have different temperature ranges, that have different humidity ranges, that sort of thing, was a massive effort to bring people together with that kind of knowledge with our client, Microsoft. It was a big effort. It required a lot of data, a lot of research in finding data about things that are not standard, like tanks, for example, instead of racks. But that is a huge emerging trend that we're seeing in the sustainability field, is the sustainability around data centers, because there's such a boom in interest in building data centers for AI. And so what else is really interesting is this hasn't come out yet, but we have submitted a book chapter to go into a book about human-centered AI. And our chapter, authored by WSP employees, is about sustainability and AI. And it's both, how can AI help enhance sustainability, but also what are the sustainability considerations of AI? So both
Mm,
ways. And what's really interesting there is there is tremendous potential for AI to help enable sustainability. For example, like AI-enabled LCA tools, which we are working on with our Emerge partnership with a startup called Circa. And so we're working on creating better, faster, more intuitive tools that are easier to use and can leverage data that are available on the internet through things like environmental product declarations, which can be quite time consuming to manually scrape all the data out of them. So working on ways to use AI to automate that process, working on ways to use AI to read a bill of materials. So imagine all the things it takes to make a bridge. That's a very large, long bill of materials. And it's very tedious for a human to go through it and match it individually to all of the data sets we need in the databases to do the lifecycle assessment and make sure it makes sense. We can automate a lot of that through AI to save time, to save budget, to get to answers faster, and to take away some of the tedious parts of doing lifecycle assessments so that our professionals can spend more time on the more meaningful and useful parts, like what do we do with all this information? What does it mean? How do we use it to reduce the environmental impacts of data centers or agriculture or electricity, food systems, all kinds of things? It gives us more time to focus on that. And I don't mean to just plug all my papers, but we did also have a paper come out somewhat recently in the International Journal of LCA, the first, again, of our knowledge of applying AI to do data quality assessment in life cycle assessment. So using AI to tell us, to give us an overall score and rating of the data we've used to do an LCA based on how representative it is in time, how representative it is of technology type. So the most recent technologies that are being used in the world to do the same thing, that could be different technologies all over the world, and geographic representation. Those were the three that we tested with that particular paper. But there are other aspects too, like reproducibility and other scientific aspects. And again, so if we could train AI, a large language model, to do that for us and be a bit more objective, perhaps, than a human being, it could improve overall data quality. So there's lots of ways we could use AI to improve sustainability. And some of the sustainability considerations about AI has to do with electricity use. It's going to take a lot of electricity to be able to scale AI. I don't think I'm telling anyone something they don't already know, but I think it's important to be using LCA along the way to look at the trade-offs between using different types, different sources of electricity in different places, matching that with different cooling systems, both cooling systems for the entire data center, but also cooling systems specifically for the racks, because those two things can be different. And how you match those and what kinds of effects not only does that have, I mean, we have people across WSP who specialize specifically just in designing data centers. So what does that mean for the operation and the long-term operation and maintenance of the data center, but also what does it mean for the sustainability aspects of it and which again, matching which technologies would go best with even different types of AI data center, whether it's a training data center, an inference, or some combination. What kinds of technology is it using in terms of CPUs versus GPUs? What kinds of rack cooling technology? What kinds of data center heat rejection technology? All these things, there's so many things to consider. And we want to be optimizing not just for cost and longevity, but also for environmental sustainability.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way to think about it, right? Like, how can sustainability help AI, and how can AI help sustainability? Kind of that back and forth cycle, which is interesting, and a lot of the stuff that you went through sounds like it can really have an impact. So, Julie, can you share an example of a project where using LCA led to a significant sustainability outcome? Just maybe tell us a little bit about one that you've had experience with.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. So I feel like I've talked about data centers a lot. So I'm going to switch gears. I'm going to talk about food because I like food too. We do a lot of different types of LCAs here. One of the great ones that we did a couple of years ago, we were actually able to publish what's called an ISO conformant and critically reviewed LCA report. So there are ISO standards that govern life cycle assessment. That's 1440 and 1444. I actually sit on the technical advisory group, or TAG. Sometimes it's called the technical committee, or TC, for ISO tag 207, which actually oversees those particular standards. So I've been on that tag for a number of years. But what's important about the standards is that they enable comparability. So they have very specific guidelines and rules for how to do a comparative study. And a number of years ago, we were approached by a novel company called Perfect Day, who makes whey, 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 without cows. So whey is a fraction of milk, but they make it without bovine or any other animal sourced dairy. They make it by using fermentation with microbes and feeding them sugar, and those microbes, as a product of their metabolism, produce whey. Okay, so they produce whey protein without cows, and they wanted to compare the environmental impacts of that whey protein to other types of protein, any type of protein from bovine dairy milk. So we conducted a study where we looked at all of the inputs throughout their whey's life cycle, everything it takes to produce the sugar, the microbes, the fermentation process, the co-products that are produced, because it's very rare that you ever produce only one thing, right? All of that, sum that all up. But then we also looked at published literature sources of life cycle impact data on bovine dairy and the protein from that dairy produced in different parts of the world, because you can imagine, just like a data center, different climates, different environments, different cows are going to produce milk in a different way. So we looked at 4 different studies to get the greenhouse gas emissions, energy, and water. And then we were able to compare protein to protein. And what our results showed, and this is still publicly available, it's on their website. You can actually read the entire study if you really want to. It's very long. We put together a comparative isoconformant life cycle assessment report that went through external critical review by 3 independent experts who know things about life cycle assessment and food systems and dairy. And we put together this report that demonstrated that this whey protein had substantially lower greenhouse gas emissions, energy, and water. The greenhouse gas emissions were up to 99%. The water was, I want to say, it was up to 80 something percent, and the energy reduction was up to 60%, or I might have those two flipped. But anyway, we were able to demonstrate significant environmental impact reduction from producing this product that goes into countless foods. I mean, the number
Yeah.
of times, I've turned over a package of bread and been like, there's whey in this. Interesting. It's whey is prized not just for being a source of protein, but adding certain textures and mouthfeel to food, right? Things that people really care about, including ice cream. We also did another comparative assessment on an ice cream made with this whey protein compared to conventional dairy ice cream. And so I would call that a significant sustainability outcome, because this company was then able to take this very rigorous report to their investors and to their customers, which is more B2B, not exactly B2C, but more business to business, and explain to them the comparative environmental benefits of using their way compared to conventional way, side by side with how they present on cost, how they present on taste, mouthfeel, all these other really important aspects of their product. They're able to present greenhouse gas emissions, energy, and water all side by side right next to that. And I think that that's the kind of really powerful data that we need to have in order to make informed decisions to reduce environmental impacts.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it's obviously, like you said, the amount that whey is used to be able to find an alternative like that could have a huge positive impact. And again, kind of a running theme of the conversation today, but it goes a lot back to the data, right? That's available for you to be
Yes.
able to use in your assessments, which is really important. All right, Julie. So usually for our last question, we do a PM pitfall type question. I'm going to slightly modify it today. And the question that I want to wrap us up with is, if you could influence one major change in how industries approach sustainability, what would
Mm.
it be?
Oh, wow. That's a big question. I mean, how industries approach sustainability. I really hope that people maintain an open mind to all of the different potential ways of evaluating sustainability. Sometimes I get a little worried that we too myopically focus on carbon. And yes, carbon is very important. You're right. You're absolutely right. When people are like, yeah, but climate change, it's happening. We're seeing effects of it. We need to do something about it today, right now. Yes, I agree. You're right. However, we don't want to have unintended consequences of blinders, carbon, carbon, carbon. And we might miss, oh, but if we make this choice, it actually could very negatively affect water, or it could very negatively affect air quality, something like
Mm,
that. And we want to be very careful not to solely focus and optimize only for carbon. I mean, we know this. If you only optimize for cost, you might end up with a very affordable product that doesn't work, right? That could happen. It probably has happened. So we don't want to over stress any one particular environmental impact. I think that could be quite a pitfall. I think we also need to be careful as PMs to try to plan things out as far in advance. It's like when you're teaching someone to drive, you tell them, yes, you have to pay attention to what's going on right in front of you, but you also need to look up at the horizon because there might be an accident up ahead, and you might want to
mhm,
exit here, right? And not go get stuck in that traffic jam and figure out a different path. And so, again, going back to why it's important to try to think through LCAs early on in the process. And that doesn't mean you have to go do a whole isoconformant critically reviewed LCA that takes months and it results in like a 30-page long paper. No, you could do screening level assessments when you have
mm,
certain decision points. Just make sure that that's a factor. Make sure that sustainability and some sort of environmental assessment is a factor in that multi-criteria decision-making process and not just carbon. It it can be enticing because often, because there's so much focus on carbon, there is more data out there about carbon than there ever has been before. We've got life cycle inventory data. We've got these published studies. We've got economic input output, environmentally extended input output, or EIO data that we can use. So it can be pretty quick to do a back of the envelope, carbon versus carbon. Should we do this? Should we do that? But again, we don't want to miss all of these other environmental impacts. And life cycle assessment is a very holistic approach. A true life cycle assessment, to be called that, has to evaluate more than just carbon. If it only evaluates carbon, it's only a product carbon footprint, which is still valid and useful. But the whole point of LCA, and part of the reason I got into it in the first place, is not just that it takes the scientific method and actually tries to apply it to understand which options are more sustainable, but it's holistic. It thinks about more than just carbon. It thinks about more than just one step in the process too,
mm,
right? It's not only about the raw materials. It's not only about the transportation. It's not only about the manufacturing. It's about all of it. It's even with food. It's even all the way through. If you know what kind of a product it's going to go into, you could look at ice cream versus ice cream or bread versus bread, and how that thing is stored or prepared or cooked, and what happens, how much of it is wasted, and what are the ramifications of that. A life cycle assessment, I think, is so powerful for PMs, not even just as a sustainability tool, but it's a great framework to just be thinking big, be thinking holistically, be thinking about more than what's right in front of you, and try to plan out more ahead of time. You know, if you've got this project coming down the pipeline, maybe you want to say, hey, let's put something in the schedule to think about the environmental impacts, maybe do a screening level LCA when we're considering different materials. You know, and you
Mm,
don't it doesn't have to be this giant insurmountable thing. If you're like, look, I just don't think the client's going to go for doing this on the whole. You know, there is something called whole building LCA. If you don't think the client's going to go for that, there's not time or budget and schedule. Maybe there's like one little thing you could carve out and say, like, we have a serious decision point between cross laminated timber or conventional, you know, rebar and concrete. Why don't we look at if there are sections of this building we
right.
could use cross laminated timber on, and what would be the overall sustainability outcome from doing that? And is there a nice story to tell out of that? Also, cross laminated timber is nice looking. I've
Yeah.
seen it myself. My husband works in construction, and I've toured buildings that he's built that have it. So, you know, how can we use the sustainability part and the beauty of the product and the cost savings potentially to tell a holistic, great story in the outcome?
Yeah, I like that. Basically, PMs, you really need to take a more holistic approach around sustainability. And while carbon reduction is important, it's not the only piece of environmental sustainability. And we need to keep that in mind. And I think really to do that, what you need to do as a project manager, kind of to Julie's point, is I would say even at the proposal stage of your process, you're asking yourself where are the environmental impacts in this project and how can we reduce them? Because again, I think if you can build that into your proposal pitch, it's a big positive, right? In today's world, we're trying to really save the environment, be more sustainable. And if you can bring that to the table for your clients before they select someone, that may be the reason they select you. So I think, having that holistic mindset from the beginning and approach from the beginning is really important. Well, once again, Dr. Julie Sinistore, Senior Vice President, WSP. Julie, I want to thank you so much for spending some time with us here on the AEC Project Management Podcast.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Julie. I do believe taking a more holistic approach around environmental sustainability can make you a better project manager and can help you to serve your clients better. If you enjoyed our conversation, please subscribe to our channel here. We put out videos like this on a weekly basis to help AEC professionals become better project managers. I'll see you next week.